The night was black and bitter. The English Channel rolled like a restless beast, its waves thrashing under sheets of icy rain. Two lone figures slipped silently into the water, Major Logan Scott Bowden and Sergeant Bruce Ogden Smith. The cold stabbed through their wetsuits as they swam toward a coastline held by Hitler's army. Somewhere beyond the surf lay Normandy, still under occupation, still crawling with enemy sentries. There were no medals waiting for them, no cheering crowds. Only the darkness, the pounding sea, and the knowledge that one mistake could change the course of the coming invasion, and perhaps, the war itself. As they swam, the current tugged them east, threatening to pull them off course. The sea was merciless, heaving and shoving, each wave another battle to win. Through the blur of rain, the only light they could see was the beam of a distant lighthouse cutting across the water. They fixed their direction on that glimmer, pushing through exhaustion until their feet finally scraped sand. It was New Year's Eve, 1943. Above them, in the small French village of La Rivière, German soldiers celebrated with beer and laughter. But down below, hidden in the darkness, two British frogmen crouched low, catching their breath behind the wooden groins of the beach. The irony wasn't lost on them. While the enemy sang songs to welcome another year of occupation, these two men risked everything to prepare the way for liberation. Scott Bowden and Ogden Smith moved swiftly down the beach, hunched against the wind. The storm worked in their favor. It was a filthy night, perfect for what they had to do. The intelligence report said the beach was free of mines, at least, on this stretch, but they knew better than to trust paper reports. Every step was cautious. Every sound, even the whistle of the wind, felt like a potential alarm. They stopped. Scott Bowden unfolded a small waterproof map. "Here," he whispered. "The W section." Their mission was precise: gather sand samples. 20 cores from different depths and positions, arranged in the shape of a letter, a W. To any outsider, it would seem absurd, risking their lives for sand. But the fate of the entire Allied invasion might depend on what that sand revealed. They needed to know if the beaches could hold tanks, trucks, and heavy artillery. If the sand was too soft, the invasion could collapse before it even began. Using a metal auger, they drilled into the ground, turning it half a rotation and pulling up samples, grains of earth that would determine the strength of the Allied landings. Each sample was packed into 10-inch tubes, fitted into a bandolier across Ogden Smith's chest. The rain drove harder, slapping against their faces. Now and again, they froze as muffled laughter drifted from the village above. A few German soldiers, stumbling out for fresh air, could have spotted them at any moment. The pair worked in near silence, moving from point to point, digging, turning, sealing, checking. Finally, the samples were collected. It was time to leave. But when they waded into the surf, the sea fought back. The waves rose higher, the current dragged stronger, throwing them down and pulling them under. Twice they tried. Twice they were hurled back onto the sand. The risk of being seen was growing with every second. Scott Bowden's mind raced. If they were captured, the Germans would discover the tubes, and the Allies' greatest secret would be lost. The lighthouse beam flashed across the waves again, and in that brief light, he saw the pattern of the surf. Timing was everything. On the next lull between waves, they plunged forward, swimming furiously. Behind him, through the roar of the storm, Scott Bowden heard a shout. His heart jumped. Had the Germans spotted them? He turned to see Ogden Smith, arm raised, grinning through the spray. "Happy New Year," he shouted. Scott Bowden could hardly believe it. "Bloody fool," he muttered, but deep down, he smiled. Humor was the only shield they had left against the cold and fear. Those two men weren't ordinary soldiers, they were part of one of Britain's most secretive units. Few even knew it existed. Its name sounded mundane, bureaucratic, Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, or COP. But its members were pioneers, divers, sailors, engineers, and commandos trained to go where no man was supposed to go, under the radar, under the waves, and onto enemy shores before anyone else dared to land there. To understand how COP came to be, you have to go back, before Normandy, before the Channel crossings, to one man, Lieutenant Commander Nigel Clogstown Wilmot. Wilmot was a career naval officer, a thoughtful, almost scholarly man. But behind his calm demeanor was a restless determination shaped by the failures of the past. His uncle Henry had served in the First World War, during the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. As a young boy, Wilmot had listened to stories of brave men sent to die on beaches they didn't understand, of British, Australian, and New Zealand troops gunned down on cliffs they never should have attacked. The lesson was seared into his mind: never land where you haven't looked. When the Second World War broke out, it seemed the British military had forgotten that lesson. Again and again, amphibious assaults failed because the planners didn't know the terrain. In 1940, Wilmot saw it firsthand during the Norwegian campaign. British troops tried to land in unfamiliar fjords, with no charts, no reconnaissance, and no understanding of local conditions. Ships ran aground, soldiers were stranded, and the entire operation collapsed. To Wilmot, it was unforgivable. He decided to change it. By early 1941, he was appointed navigation officer for a planned invasion of Rhodes, a vital island in the Mediterranean. Once again, the same problem surfaced: almost no intelligence on the beaches. Nobody knew if tanks could roll ashore, or if mines or reefs would block their approach. So Wilmot did something few officers dared. He asked permission to go look for himself. Rear Admiral Harold Bailey-Groman, in charge of the operation, hesitated. Sending a single man into enemy waters in a dinghy was nearly suicidal. But Wilmot was persuasive, and Britain was desperate. The country was alone against Hitler's empire, its back to the wall. Out of that desperation, new ideas were born, and Wilmot's was one of them. He joined forces with Major Roger Courtney, an adventurer who commanded a small, experimental unit called the Special Boat Section, precursor to today's Special Boat Service. Courtney had once canoed the length of the White Nile just for the challenge. When Wilmot asked for help, Courtney grinned. "I'll paddle you in," he said. And so they went. 2 men in a small inflatable, rowing through the dark toward an enemy-held island. They mapped beaches, measured tides, and found hidden obstacles that could have doomed an entire invasion. Their mission was a success, and more than that, it proved a point. Detailed reconnaissance could save thousands of lives. But not everyone agreed. Many senior officers in the British military viewed these private armies with suspicion. The very idea of small, irregular units sneaking around enemy shores offended their sense of tradition. They wanted battles fought with discipline and formality, not rubber boats and frogmen. It would take disaster to change their minds. That disaster came in August 1942, the Deep Raid. The plan was to test German defenses on the French coast, to gather intelligence for future invasions. But the intelligence going in was tragically wrong. British planners had relied on pre-war postcards to study the terrain. They had no idea what awaited them. When the raid began, it was a slaughter. German machine guns tore through landing craft before they even touched shore. Tanks bogged down in pebbles. Troops had nowhere to retreat. Nearly 3,000 Canadians and Britons were killed or captured. Even the Americans, who sent a small contingent of Rangers, suffered heavy losses. Wilmot watched the aftermath with grim vindication. Everything he had warned about had come true. In the wake of Deep, no one could deny it any longer. Reconnaissance wasn't optional. It was essential. By late 1942, Wilmot's idea finally received official sanction. His small team of beach surveyors, divers, and navigators became the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties, COP. Their mission, to scout and map beaches for future Allied landings, working in secrecy so deep that even most of the armed forces didn't know they existed. Their first major task came in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. The lessons from that success convinced the Admiralty to expand COP into a permanent unit. In 1943, a new face joined the ranks, Major Logan Scott Bowden, a soldier who quickly became Wilmot's right-hand man. Alongside him was a young naval officer named Jim Booth, who volunteered out of sheer boredom after months of minesweeping duty in the North Sea. They were mad, Booth later recalled with a chuckle, but in a nice way. "We all just wanted to do something that mattered." Training took place on Hayling Island, off England's southern coast. There, under Wilmot's stern supervision, recruits learned to navigate by moonlight, dive in freezing waters, and approach enemy beaches undetected. Wilmot was ruthless. He dismissed anyone who couldn't meet his impossible standards. He was kind, but bloody tough, Booth remembered. Everything had to be perfect: navigation, timing, endurance. There was no room for error. By December 1943, the Allies were deep in planning for the greatest invasion in history, the return to France. The coastline of Normandy had been chosen, but questions remained. Was the sand strong enough to bear tanks? Could vehicles cross the tidal flats without sinking? The answers had to come from men willing to go there and find out. Scott Bowden and Ogden Smith volunteered without hesitation. They conducted a test run on an English beach, perfecting their auger sampling technique. It worked. Within days, they would perform the real mission, crossing into occupied France, slipping ashore beneath the noses of German sentries, and bringing back the truth hidden in the sand. That New Year's Eve, as fireworks burst over London and the rest of England celebrated another year of survival, two men in black wetsuits crawled up a hostile beach in Normandy. They carried nothing more deadly than a sampling drill, but the fate of D-Day was in their hands. They returned home undetected, their mission a complete success. The samples proved that the beaches could bear the weight of tanks and vehicles, confirming what the Allied scientists had feared to guess. When the news reached the top, even the Americans took notice. General Omar N. Bradley, commander of all U.S. forces for the D-Day assault, sent word if the British beaches had been examined, he wanted the same for the Americans. The next target, Omaha Beach. But this time, the men wouldn't swim in. They would ride something new, something built for stealth and survival in the most dangerous waters in the world, the X-class midget submarine. For the men of COP, the mission was only beginning. The winter of 1943 brought with it more than cold winds and Atlantic storms. It brought decision. The Allies were now preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in human history, but as each new general's plan was drawn on the map, one critical question loomed over everything: what lay beneath those beaches? Aerial photos gave only hints, shadows of sandbars, white streaks where waves broke on hidden reefs. But to know what thousands of men would face when they stormed the coast of France, someone had to step into the surf and find out. That task fell to the men of COP, the Combined Operations Pilotage Parties. They were trained at Hayling Island, a small, quiet base on England's southern coast, where every night the tide crept in over the shingle beaches and the wind smelled of salt and oil. There, under strict secrecy, sailors and engineers learned how to measure tides by moonlight, how to crawl through the surf without leaving a trace, and how to escape unseen if the enemy found them. The work was delicate, dangerous, and oddly scientific. They used grease pencils and waterproof notebooks to record every sandbank and slope. Sometimes they gathered sand samples in tiny metal tubes to test whether the beaches of France could hold the weight of tanks. Most men in the Allied forces never heard of COP. Even those who worked nearby saw only glimpses, a handful of quiet men in naval uniforms slipping away at dusk, returning in the pale dawn, tired and salt-crusted, saying nothing. They practiced night after night, timing the rhythm of the tides, crawling through cold water until their fingers went numb. They learned how to use midget submarines, small, two-man craft known as X-craft, to carry them close to enemy shores. It was not glamorous work. The X-craft were claustrophobic metal tubes packed with air tanks, oxygen scrubbers, and the faint, ever-present stench of diesel. Inside, the temperature swung between freezing and suffocating. The men had to be both sailors and survivors, able to endure hours of silence beneath the waves while the world above went on unaware. Yet despite the discomfort, these missions became the foundation of the Allied invasion. Every map, every beach profile, every tidal chart that guided the landings, all of it depended on the secret labor of these few men. By late 1943, their work turned toward one name whispered through every Allied headquarters: Normandy. The chosen beaches stretched for miles along the northern coast of France, but their details were still unknown. Were there reefs? Mines? Mud flats? Or hidden defenses waiting just below the surface? To answer those questions, COP men would have to slip right under the enemy's nose. In the dark waters of the English Channel, the first test missions began. 2 X-craft, each barely longer than a bus, crept out from England's southern ports. Inside, crews of 4 men crouched shoulder to shoulder, 2 pilots, an engineer, and a navigator. Every sound mattered. The smallest clang could echo through the hull, betraying their position to a German patrol. They whispered instead of speaking, turned dials with gloved hands, and prayed that the sea would stay calm. Their goal was simple in words but perilous in execution: to approach the French coast, surface just offshore, and send 2 swimmers, known as frogmen, to collect samples and measure gradients. When the first missions reached the Normandy coast, they found themselves in the middle of a hostile sea. German patrol boats swept the waters constantly, and mines lay thick in the shallows. The men waited hours, watching the shoreline through narrow periscopes. Then, under the cover of moonlight, the frogmen slipped into the black water. They swam silently, carrying metal sample tubes tied to their belts and small compasses strapped to their wrists. Beneath them, the seabed sloped gently toward the shore, a good sign. But closer in, they felt the drag of soft sand. In some places, it sank halfway to the knee. Tanks would bog down instantly. They took their samples, marked the depths, and turned back, every muscle burning from cold. Behind them, the faint rumble of German trucks carried over the wind. Patrol lights swept across the surf. One flash too long, and they'd be caught. But somehow, they weren't. The frogmen reached the X-craft, gasping, shivering, their hands raw. The submarine slipped back beneath the waves, vanishing into the safety of the deep. When they returned to England days later, they brought back more than sand. They brought knowledge, the kind that would decide the fate of thousands. By early 1944, COP missions were running constantly. They surveyed every potential landing site along the French coast, from the Cotentin Peninsula to the beaches east of Caen. Each report grew thicker, more precise. Engineers translated the data into detailed invasion maps, complete with tide lines and underwater contours. The information changed everything. Some beaches, once favored, were found to be death traps. Others, like Gold, Juno, and Sword, proved perfect for landings. The men of COP had turned uncertainty into certainty, guesswork into geometry. But their work wasn't finished. There remained one final task: to guide the invasion itself. For that, they would use a new kind of vessel, the X-20 and X-23 midget submarines. These craft would serve as floating beacons, stationed just off the Normandy coast in the early hours of June 6, 1944. Their job: mark the exact landing zones for the Allied assault. It was a plan as daring as it was suicidal. Training for this final mission began in spring 1944. The crews practiced for weeks, navigating in darkness, timing their ascents to the minute, learning to survive the long hours of waiting beneath the sea. One of those men was Lieutenant Commander George Honor, a seasoned submariner known for his calm under pressure. His vessel, X-23, would take position off Sword Beach. Another, Lieutenant K.R. Hudspeth, would command X-20 off Juno Beach. Together, these two crews would hold their nerve through the longest night of the war. As D-Day approached, the tension on England's coast was palpable. Ports were crowded with landing craft. Airfields hummed with the constant roar of bombers. But somewhere far from the noise and fanfare, a handful of men prepared to vanish quietly beneath the sea. They loaded their submarines with rations, signal buoys, and coded maps. The hatches sealed with a metallic thud. Then, one by one, the X-craft slipped away from England's shore, small shadows moving through the darkness, heading toward destiny. The journey to Normandy took nearly 2 days. Inside the cramped hulls, air grew heavy and stale. Condensation dripped from the ceiling, and the walls felt as though they were closing in. The men barely spoke. They listened to the steady hum of the motors and the distant heartbeat of the sea. Above them, the world was preparing for invasion. Thousands of ships were gathering in secret, waiting for the order. But for these 8 men, inside 2 midget submarines, the invasion had already begun. They were the advance ghosts of D-Day, unseen and uncelebrated, holding position beneath the waves. By the night of June 5, they reached their targets. The sea was rough, the wind howled, and the tide dragged against the anchors. But the submarines held steady. Inside, the crew stared at their watches, counting the hours. They were there, waiting, while history approached from the horizon. Outside, the ocean was dark as ink. Every sound, every creak of the hull, every gust of wind felt amplified. The men barely dared to breathe. And somewhere out there, just beyond the surf, the beaches of Normandy waited, silent, deadly, and about to become the center of the world. The night before D-Day was a storm. Rain lashed against the channel, waves rose like black mountains, and the wind howled through the rigging of ships that stretched for miles. Thousands of soldiers huddled in cramped landing craft, seasick and silent, while destroyers rolled and pitched in the darkness. But beneath all that fury, in the cold silence of the sea, 2 tiny submarines waited. X-20 and X-23, each no larger than a city bus, held their positions just off the French coast, motionless except for the gentle sway of the tide. Inside those cramped hulls, 8 men, 4 in each craft, crouched in the gloom. Their faces were pale in the glow of dim instrument lights. Condensation dripped from the steel ceiling like cold rain. The air was foul, heavy with the smell of oil and battery acid. They had been there for nearly 2 days. No space to stand. No comfort. No sunlight. Only the hum of the motors and the endless rolling of the sea. They were alone, the first Allied forces to reach Normandy. In X-20, Lieutenant K.R. Hudspeth checked his chronometer. The minutes crawled. Every so often, his crew listened through the hydrophones, trying to pick up distant sounds, the throb of engines, the crack of sonar. Nothing. Only the whisper of the sea. Their orders were simple but deadly precise. At dawn, surface quietly. Erect 2 navigational beacons, each equipped with a light and a radio signal. These would guide the approaching landing craft to their correct sectors: Juno Beach for the Canadians, Sword Beach for the British. But until then, they had to remain hidden. One patrol boat, one lucky flare, and their mission, and lives, would be over. They ate cold rations, drank water that tasted of rust, and fought exhaustion. Hudspeth later described it simply: "We waited, and the waiting was the hardest part." Meanwhile, miles away in X-23, Lieutenant George Honor watched his depth gauge. The needle quivered slightly as the submarine drifted in the current. His men were exhausted, faces streaked with salt and sweat. Every movement in that tiny space was a negotiation, one man shifting so another could reach the controls. At one point, they heard propellers above. The crew froze. The sound grew louder, closer, the unmistakable beat of a German patrol boat. Honor ordered silence. The motors cut out. For 20 minutes, the X-23 hung in the dark, powerless, as the enemy passed overhead. A single depth charge would have ended them. But none came. When the noise faded, Honor exhaled. His men said nothing. Words were useless in moments like that. The storm above delayed the invasion by a full day. For the men below, that meant more waiting. Inside the submarines, oxygen levels fell. The air turned thick and stale, every breath heavier than the last. They slept in turns, if at all. Each minute stretched like an hour. They had been trained for hardship, but not for this. Still, they endured. On the evening of June 5, 1944, the weather finally began to calm. The sky cleared. The wind dropped. And across the channel, thousands of ships began to move. The invasion, Operation Overlord, was on. Just before dawn, Hudspeth and Honor prepared their crews. The submarines rose slowly, ballast tanks hissing, until their periscopes broke the surface. Through the mist, they could just make out the faint outline of the French coast, dark and still. It was June 6, 1944. In those final moments before history began, the men of COP had no music, no fanfare, no company. Only duty. They surfaced quietly. The hatches creaked open. Cold morning air rushed in, carrying the distant smell of seaweed and gunpowder. Hudspeth climbed halfway out, his face meeting the grey light of dawn. He could see the faint shape of Normandy, silent, sleeping, unaware of what was coming. Then, methodically, the crews began their work. They deployed 2 navigation buoys, codenamed Eureka and Shark. Each emitted a coded radar pulse that would guide the incoming armada directly to the correct landing zones. They anchored the buoys carefully, then checked the signals. Everything worked perfectly. Their final act was to raise a periscope signal lamp, a small flashing light invisible to the naked eye but readable through special allied optics. To the approaching fleet, those flashes would say one thing: this is the place. The men of COP had done their job. Now all they could do was wait. At 5:30 a.m., the horizon erupted. The calm grey sea suddenly lit with fire. Allied warships opened up with everything they had, 14-inch shells screaming overhead, explosions rippling across the coastline. The submarines rocked violently as shockwaves tore through the water. Inside, the men covered their ears, bracing as debris rained from the ceiling. Every blast felt like the world ending. And yet, when they looked through the periscope, they saw something incredible, an armada unlike anything in history. Hundreds of landing craft stretched across the horizon, pushing through the dawn mist. Destroyers and battleships fired in perfect rhythm, the thunder echoing across the sea. Above them, the sky swarmed with planes, bombers, fighters, gliders. The air itself seemed to vibrate with power. Hudspeth later wrote that it was like watching the ocean come alive. The men in those submarines were the first to witness D-Day in its entirety. They saw the very beginning, the first flashes, the first landings, the first terrible cost. As the landing craft neared the beaches, X-20 and X-23 transmitted their coded signals, guiding each wave precisely to its mark. Without those signals, thousands of troops could have landed off course, straight into stronger defenses or impassable terrain. But because of the COP men, the assault waves hit exactly where they were meant to. In the hours that followed, the beaches turned into chaos, explosions, smoke, the cries of men. The smell of burning fuel and seawater filled the air. Yet miles offshore, beneath the surface, the 2 tiny submarines stayed on station. They couldn't help. They could only witness. For hours, they held their position, relaying signals, enduring the concussions of naval fire, until at last, by mid-afternoon, their task was complete. Only then did they slip quietly away, unseen by the thousands of soldiers fighting above them. They returned to England 2 days later, exhausted, deafened, and hollow-eyed. But alive. And behind them, on the shores of Normandy, the great tide of history had begun to turn. When the war ended, the men of COP received little recognition. Their missions had been too secret, their records too classified. For decades, almost no one knew that before the invasion fleet ever sailed, there had been a handful of men beneath the waves, measuring the sand, charting the tides, risking everything so others could land safely. It wasn't until the 1950s that the story began to emerge, and even then, it was told quietly, almost shyly, as if such courage spoke loudest when whispered. Many of those men never sought medals or fame. They simply went home, married, raised families, and grew old in peace. But their legacy lived on, in the maps, in the planning doctrines, in every modern beach reconnaissance that followed. The methods they invented were later used in Korea, Vietnam, and even the Falklands. The quiet legacy of COP became the backbone of amphibious warfare for generations. Today, the men of COP are remembered by only a few divers, historians, and sailors who understand what it means to face the sea alone. On Hailing Island, where they once trained, there stands a simple stone memorial. It bears just a few words, for those who went before the storm. That phrase says everything. Before the noise and chaos of war, before the headlines and victory parades, there were men who went first, unseen, unheard, and unheralded. They faced the enemy in silence, not with guns, but with courage and craft. When we think of D-Day, we remember the heroes who stormed the beaches. But perhaps we should also remember the ones who were already there, in the darkness, beneath the waves, guiding them in. They were the first to arrive, and the last to leave. And because of them, the course of history never drifted off target.